there's a couple of different TV shows out there. One is The Law and Order, which always seemed to be indict first, ask questions later. And we try to ask questions first and then indict later. And the reason we do that is because we're a court of limited jurisdiction. So if there is, setting aside the examples of the violent crime initiatives, where there's typically a violent crime or street level crime, that's going to go to a local police department and get heard pretty quickly. We're not as flexible as the state courts. The state court, certainly the state court I was in, at any time of the day, you could get a search warrant, arrest, and get somebody arraigned. Whereas the federal system, it's just not. You just don't have that. You just don't have those resources. But to answer your question, that is how a case like that would come to our attention. And then other people have asked at similar presentations, other folks have asked, well, how, like in a drug case, I mean, how do you end up in federal court versus state court? And my primary response is it really depends on who arrests you. DEA arrests you, you're probably going to federal court. But frankly, you're working for Boise PD and you've been working on a task force with DEA, and you get a case that you think would be, call your buddy at DEA, and could come that way too. But if somebody else is just working patrol and they find somebody with a similar amount of money and drugs and guns, and they've worked with us before, that may just go to Ada County. So on the drug cases, it kind of depends on who arrests you. But for the white collar cases, typically the victim will call in and they'll get steered fairly quickly to the FBI or to tax, and the case will start from there. So for in the department, the Department of Justice is the big umbrella organization with Eric Holder at the top, and then within what we call Main Justice, there are 7 litigating divisions that have several thousand attorneys. But we don't see them that much in the field. Most of what we do here, probably 98% of our cases that are prosecuted in Idaho are prosecuted by assistant U.S. attorneys that are here in Idaho. Then across the country, there are approximately 10,000 assistant United States attorneys. So when you think about the numbers at a federal level, both from the investigatory level to the case filing level to the attorney level, and then through the courts, including probation, you'll find that caseloads are lower than your counterparts. When I was in Recorder's Court in the city of Detroit, I'd open my filing cabinet and I'd have at least 75 cases. And then when I went to the federal government, when I went to the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Eastern District of Michigan, I had probably half of those. But each case requires more time. So going back to the building the mansions versus the pitching and tent, in the state court, it's much more like triage, because you're trying to get through these cases as fast as you can, because more and more are coming through the door because you're not a court of limited jurisdiction in Ada or Canyon County, you're general jurisdiction. So generally, cases are coming to you. So when it gets referred to the federal court, to the federal system, you'll have more time to work on it. You'll have more expectations as far as proofs, written work, everything associated with the federal court. With a federal court case is more complex than a state court case, generally speaking. So, if you were to take the hours I spent in state courts versus the hours I spent in federal court at work, it's about the same. The numbers, the caseload is fewer, but you're putting more time into each one. And so that, if any of you are thinking about being probation officers, that holds true as well for probation. They have more time to devote to individual supervisees, but that's because they have fewer. So it's not an easier job by comparison. It's just different. Now, on the victim's rights angle, handed out the general flyer that we hand out at the federal level to victims. And just like everything else in law, a victim is a defined term. So, you have to be a victim, either financial emotional or physical of the crime charge, then you become a victim. There are some cases, for example, the drug cases, that are you technically at the federal level victimless crime. So if there's a drug endangered child in the house, they're not technically a victim at the federal level. But you will see it in both in the federal system and all the way on down as victims' rights have developed. There are common themes, and for us, you know, our Bible and our go-by are the Justice for All Act and the Crime Victim Rights Act of 2004. And in this handout I gave you, the rights are spelled out there, and we're bound by these acts to make sure that victims' rights are enforced. And typically at all the levels, the rights center around a victim's right to be heard. Went back certainly when I started in '87 and at the state court level, the victims' right movement was really just getting off the ground, but it was fairly well advanced in Detroit because goodness knows we had our fair share of victims. But you wanted the community, and as the community became more involved, and they worked with their legislators, and with their legislators they passed laws to make sure they're heard. Number one, if somebody is charged with a crime in which they're a victim, they have a right to know. And then as that case moves through the system, they have a right to be alerted as to each and every stage of the proceeding, and a right to be heard should they so choose. And towards the tail end of a criminal proceeding during sentencing, that's when the right to be heard is probably most significant. And they file what we call in the federal system victim impact statements. So they have an opportunity to voice their concerns with the sentencing judge. And those rights are fairly common across the board in all the jurisdictions that we'll be talking about. So that was very significant. And in fact, if we fail to provide those rights to individual victims, they can file a complaint against us for doing so.
But how many complaints do you file a year?
Oh, across the country?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know across the country. I can tell you here, it was one. And I think the concern for, and I can't talk about that case in particular, but I think the concerns and the horrors that prosecutors saw back then is that somebody would use what should be, a benefit and something that should be encouraged to be used as a sword. And that is that they, if somebody was a victim, and trust me, the cases that were the most difficult for us as prosecutors, but also for police officers, are domestic violence situations, because for the folks that have been through courses on it, they talk about this cycle of violence, and you usually get the person at the bottom of the cycle of violence, but then as the case works its way through the system, you come back to court after 2 or 3 appearances, and the next thing you know, everybody they're both sitting together, and then our fear of fears was then the victim, who was truly the victim that we're trying to prosecute, but then is back with the abuser, and he or she is going to use the spouse or the significant other then to attack you as a prosecutor, saying you didn't afford the individual's rights, and that because the person shouldn't be prosecuted, you were violating their rights. That by and large, just didn't happen. But all the information that we provide to folks gives them the notice, and we do our best to make sure that they're consulted. It's important that we communicate that it's a consultation, much like when we consult with the agencies, because we're charged with representing all of the United States, it's not just an individual action of one person against another. So we have to weigh the interests of all parties involved. And so they may not agree with a certain setting. the DEA agent might not agree with a certain settlement, but we make sure that everybody has that right to be heard. We listen to their concerns, and then we go forward. In many of the cases, financial cases as well, it's like, well, if the person's not going to give me 100% restitution, he should go to trial. And you think, well, if they had 100% restitution to give you, that would be, that'd be a good idea. But if they don't, trying the case isn't going to make any difference. And having the person plead, and under the federal system, when they plead, they get certain points off their guideline range for acceptance of responsibility. It's not very significant, but we have to make that determination in the interest of all the parties. So complaints are few and far between, and I think that what people, on my side of the table, were up in arms about back in the day really didn't materialize. People were afraid then that you'd have the prosecutor at trial counsel's table, and seated next to them would be the attorney for the victim. That parade of horribles did not happen. But frankly, with the way the law is written, if we don't provide the appropriate service to the victim, you'll get a complaint filed, and it's taken very seriously. All right, and now we're going to move. Does anybody have any question about the federal system? Okay. The one thing I did want to mention, given that you're criminal justice majors, is that of course, the end of, in my viewpoint, a successful prosecution, but my counterpart Dick Rubin, the Federal Defender's Office would say an unsuccessful prosecution is prison. And as you know, the prison population has been booming. A lot of what we saw in the mid-'80s, those mandatory minimums I talked about, people were getting 10, 20, up to lifetime imprisonment sentences, and a lot. And it doesn't take that much math to get your mandatory minimum of 10 years. It's 500 grams of a mixture or substance, as the statute is written, which is just a hair over a pound of methamphetamine. And virtually every week, somebody in this valley is getting popped with 2 to 5 pounds of methamphetamine, and so that's significant. So the average daily population in 2012 for the Bureau of Prisons, that is our federal Department of Corrections, was 217,000 prisoners, and their population. I was reading something before I came over. Their population was stagnant for like 40 years, and then through the 80s it doubled, and then doubled again. It's really alarming. And if anyone's interested in the annual cost, it is upwards of $27,000 per prisoner per year. So what we've tried to do at the federal level, and I know the states and the other court systems we'll talk about, people are talking about alternatives to federal prosecution. But for us, most of the alternatives to federal prosecution falls back on the states, because they're the ones with general jurisdiction. We're limited, so we're not going to go out and prosecute somebody who is ripe for a drug diversion program or something like that. You leave that to the state. You focus your limited resources on significant drug traffickers and violent felons. It's not to say that we don't have our system. We do have a system, we call it a reentry court. So after people go to prison, they can come out and be part of this reentry court. And so we support their reintroduction into the community. The Bureau of Prisons does a pretty good job of transitioning prisoners out, but it is something I do in our office. I'm the head of what we call our START program. It's pretty astounding when you're talking to somebody that comes out that's just turned 30, and they spent 10 years in the federal pen, and they had a couple other state violations and served time before they went to the pen, and then they had their juvenile record where they've been in the juvenile system that we'll talk about here shortly. And real quickly, you just add up this time, and you realize that at 30 years old, they've spent more time in prison than they've spent out on the street. And some folks have done a remarkable job of turning themselves around. Others are completely institutional. They just don't know how to get a house, get a job, get up every day without being told. They haven't had to make a decision. I don't know how to balance a checkbook. Poor guy the other day was totally, was taking classes at CWI, and he was totally taken aback and just couldn't get over the computer thing. And this guy's 35 years old.